There are handouts. There are, I don't know how complicated we want to get here, but there were handouts. We're going to finish up lesson 1 from Wednesday, and there are still, I think, some extras from that, but we may just pass on that and then just give everybody a handout for class number 2, which is the material that we're covering today. Remember that there are these handouts that are posted a day or two before each class on our website. And so, ideally, you would look on there and pull down the handout, print it for yourself even, and have that as a way to prepare and also follow along in class. But I figure I will print some each time we meet in case you're not able to do so ahead of time. So Ian is passing those out. Thank you, Ian. And we are going to pick up in a minute in Judges chapter 2 in verse 11. But let's work our way there before we jump into the text of Judges. These are the goals of the class. Still forgot to change it to plural. I'll maybe remember to do that before Wednesday. But the goals of the class are basically these. We're talking about a cycle. We're talking about a downward spiral even in the book of Judges from generation to generation as God's people continuously forget and drift away from the standard of the covenant that God had made with them at Mount Sinai. We're seeing that happen in Judges. We don't want to see that happen in our own lives. Unfortunately, I think many of us have seen that happen from time to time. And we want to avoid the cycle, the vicious cycle that happens in our lives when it comes to sin and repenting, sinning again, but also the cycle in our families and our churches. And not only avoid the downward, but try to create something that is growing, that is upward moving, that is building from year to year, from generation to generation, and develop a generational mindset of what will my kids' foundation be? What will my grandkids' foundation be? What will my kids and grandkids be able to pass on to their kids and grandkids? And how do I ensure that that is something sustainable? So those are the things we want to think about as we go through Judges. All of that centering on our third goal, which is our need for Jesus Christ. The theme of Judges, in part, is that there's no king in Israel. And with no king, the people wander and are lost. And so we, in our own lives, in this world, as we know, desperately needs a king. Particularly, we need King Jesus. And we want to think about him as we go through the stories of the Judges. These are the objectives. These are the things that if you could nail all of these at the end of the 6.5 weeks, then that would at least help to have the material in your mind so that you can make the changes that we just talked about. But these are the things that I hope that we'll be able to do. Particularly to what we're going to try to start today, start to be able to name the judges, but not just name them, but name their enemies that they conquered, and to remember with each one a unique detail about them or their story. Okay, so who's the judge? What was the enemy that they defeated? And what's something that can stick with us? And if you can do all of that for the 12 or so people that we'll talk about in Judges, then again, you'll have a better understanding of how that story goes and how our own story can go. Okay, this is something I thought about doing on Wednesday, but we just weren't going to have enough time. But I want to talk about the kind of literature that we're reading here in the book of Judges. It actually works kind of well because we also did this with the sermon today, which is that most of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, is written in story. It's called a narrative. It's a fancy word for story. And we need to understand that that's what we're reading and kind of know a little bit about how to read it if we're going to get what we want out of it. So let's say a few things about that, and then I'm sure we'll refer to this throughout the rest of our study of the book of Judges, because Judges is itself a story. In fact, more accurately, perhaps, it's a story of stories, like a comic book series that, each of these individual episodes is sewn together into a larger narrative of the entire book of Judges, which, of course, fits into the larger story of the Old Testament. But here's what we want to think about. That biblical narratives, that is stories, they are telling a story, and they are not simply, that is, they are not only or only limited to listing the factual details of what happened. Obviously, we want to be clear that the stories of the Old Testament are true, and the things that we are reading actually happen. They are historical in that sense. But there is a difference between just, well, here are the facts and just here's what happened, just to kind of lay it out. And telling a story that is maybe driving at something or highlighting something. You know this, I think, intuitively, okay? We all like to tell stories. Some of us are better at telling stories than others, okay? In fact, I thought about this the other day to this point, because I heard this happens, fairly often, but we're with a couple, and he or she started, I think it was he started to tell a story, and he said, no, you tell it. You tell it better than I do, Ever done that or had that done to you? What do we mean, you tell the story better than I do? Well, you're probably both going to relay the same basic facts, but there's a way to tell a story. And there's certain details to include at certain times, and there's a rhythm, and there's a cadence, and there's a phrasing, and there are certain things to leave out because they don't contribute to really what the story's all about, okay? And if you're good at telling a story, then you know what to include, when to include it, how to say it, and to leave out things that really don't contribute to the punchline or to the moral of the story. And when we read the Bible stories, we understand that the Bible authors, they're relaying history, of course, in the sense that these things happen, but they're telling a story. They're getting at something, and they're crafting it. There's artistry at work here in the way that they are crafting the stories for a specific purpose. Okay, so that's kind of an overall thing that we want to keep in mind. But the problem is that oftentimes biblical narratives are lacking in the details that we really want, okay? Genesis 3 is maybe a great example of this, right? Now the serpent was the craftiest of all creatures, and he spoke to the woman and said, and you're like, well, hold up here. Okay, wait, what? The snake is talking? Did all the animals talk? Just the snake talk? Was Eve surprised that the snake was talking to her? This kind of... what do these people look like? Oftentimes we're not even told much about their physical appearance. We like to know that. In particular, there's a couple things that we want to know that oftentimes are left out of the story, which is like why people did what they did in the story. And she gave to her husband, and he ate also. Well, why did he eat? Was he intimidated by his wife? Was he, didn't know what was going on? He always secretly wanted to eat it, but now is a good excuse because she ate it first? We don't know. And oftentimes we're just told what people do, not always told why they do it or maybe what they're thinking. Stories today, novels and stuff, you can get like pages and pages and pages of the inner dialogue of the character, what they're thinking to themselves. There's not very much of that at all in Bible stories. They're lacking in those kinds of details. And maybe most frustratingly of all, Bible stories usually do not get to the end of the story and say, well, then here's the lesson of the story. This is right, this was wrong, and so on, okay? The most frustrating story of all time in the Bible to me is David dancing before the ark, and he gets back, and Michal, his wife's mad at him. Why'd you dance before the ark? And he's like, well, you wouldn't know, whatever. And they bicker about it, and then the story just ends. And I think, well, who was right? Was David right for dancing before the ark, or was Michal right that David was acting the fool dancing before the ark? We're not always told explicitly in the story the moral of it. Okay, so if we're lacking in details, we're not told all the things we would like to know, and there's even some important things that we feel like we should take from it that we're not told, then what are we left to do? How are we to figure it out? And so for that reason, it's critical to pay attention to the details that we are given. Okay, when stories are told with minimal detail, then every detail is significant. Okay, and we want to pay attention to what those details are and think through how to interpret them. So this is like English 101. Remember this kind of stuff from high school. We've talked about poetry in this way before, but you probably did better in high school with stories than poetry. Maybe some of you didn't, but maybe you remember some of this stuff. Setting, okay, where does the story take place? It's in Egypt. Okay, well, what is that? What's significant about that? What do we know about Egypt? Where else does Egypt show up in the Bible? Time, and it was night, and Judas went out in John 13, and it was night. Well, what do we make of that? Maybe there's something to say. Or Nicodemus comes to Jesus at night, or Gideon, we'll see in the book of Judges, goes out and tears down the altar at night. What's significant about that? Or the cultural setting, where are they? And what were the cultural norms? And the Jacob and Esau story, this whole thing about birthright and the blessing of the firstborn, we don't really understand that in 21st century America, but you need to place yourself in the cultural setting of these stories. When are these things taking place? Where are they taking place? Pay attention to the setting. It's always important in a story. The characters, what do we know about them? names are a really important thing. We can take this too far. There are probably stories where it's not that relevant. But the story of Nabal and Abigail, and you find out that the name Nabal means fool. Okay, well that helps us a little bit with that story. Okay, so names mean things, or there are connections to things that we want to make. What family are they from? Who are they related to? What tribe are they from? And then when we are told features, then we want to pay attention to that. Saul is tall. Okay, we're told that I'm sure there are a lot of tall people in the Bible that we're not told that they were tall. But we're told Saul was head and shoulders above the rest. Well, that's significant, I think, in terms of the role that he plays in the story as the guy who looked the part, but wasn't really who God expected him or wanted him to be. So there are features that are given. When we have them, we want to hold on to them and see what significance there might be. And then something like plot. This happens a lot where we take a story on its own. Actually, probably go back to the story I talked about. I'm not saying I know all the answers, but I think part of my problem with the David and Michal story is that I'm just looking at it individually. But when you realize that the David and Michal story arguing about dancing before the ark takes place in a longer plot where there's been these characters with their conflicts and the disagreements and the themes, and then you can start to understand more of what's going on. Okay, so the character does something. Is that the beginning of the story when we're just introduced to him and he's still kind of figuring out his way? Or is it the end of the story where it's kind of like this is his climactic moment? What's the conflict that's going on in the story? And what does that teach us about how these actions should be interpreted? Okay, so again, these are some basic literary things, conflict resolution, so on. But we want to pay attention to them and not just rip things out of their context and make something of them that they're not supposed to be made of. And this may be the biggest one of all, or the one that I would emphasize the most, which is patterns. Okay, if you're ever reading a Bible story and you think to yourself, where have I seen that before? That's great. And then try to figure that out and run with it because it's likely significant. Okay? So, you're reading the story of Moses in Exodus chapter 2, and he comes to a well, and at the well in this foreign land of Midian, there's some women that come up, and they're trying to get water, but they can't, and so he helps them, and you're like, I've read this story before somewhere. Oh yeah, in Genesis, there were some other guys that were traveling in a foreign land, and they came to a well, and some women showed up. And, you start to see these, that happened to Isaac's servant when he was going to find Rebekah. It happened to Jacob when he met Rachel. Happened to Moses, and he meets his wife there. And then, ready for your mind to be blown here, you get to John chapter 4, and Jesus is traveling in a foreign land, and he comes to a well, and a woman shows up. And you're like, I've read this story before. But of course, in Jesus, it takes on a whole new meaning, because now instead of finding a romantic relationship, he is reaching out to this foreign woman as a symbol of those who are rejected and outcast that he is bringing to be his bride, his people in the church. And you're like, oh yeah, like there are patterns here. So things that look familiar. So as we're going through the book of Judges, if there are things that get repeated, or you're like, yeah, I've seen this somewhere before, those are the patterns that you want to pay attention to. Okay. That's enough. I could go on. Probably gone on too long about that. Questions or comments about how we read biblical stories? Cool. Well, let's get into let's pick up with the story that we have been talking about. Again, this is from the material I gave you on Wednesday, but this is maybe the foundation passage of the book of Judges. This is what lays it out. This lays out the whole story here. In Judges chapter 2. And so we'll use this to talk about the big themes of the book of Judges. But let's read it first. Judges chapter 2, starting in verse 11. Now, then the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. And they forsook the Lord, the God of their fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the peoples who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord to anger. So they forsook the Lord and served Baal and the Ashtaroth. The anger of the Lord burned against them, and he gave them into the hands of plunderers who plundered them, and sold them into the hands of their enemies, around them, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. Wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil, as the Lord had spoken, and as the Lord had sworn to them, so that they were severely distressed. Then the Lord raised up judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them, yet they did not listen to their judges, for they played the harlot after other gods and bowed themselves down to them. They turned aside quickly from the way in which their fathers had walked, in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do as their fathers. When the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them from the hand of their enemies in all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by the groaning because of those who oppressed and afflicted them. But it came about when the judge died that they would turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers, following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not abandon their practices or their stubborn ways. So the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he said, because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and has not listened to my voice, I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk in it as their fathers did or not. So the Lord allowed these nations to remain, not driving them out quickly, and he did not give them into the hand of Joshua. Let's go ahead and read into chapter 3 down to verse 6. Now these are the nations which the Lord left to test Israel by them, that is, all who had not experienced any of the wars of Canaan, only in order that the generations of the sons of Israel might be taught war, those who are not experienced it formerly. These nations are the 5 lords of the Philistines, and all the Canaanites, and the Sidonians, and the Hivites who lived in Mount Lebanon, from Mount Baal Hermon as far as Lebo Hamath. They were for testing Israel to find out if they would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he had commanded their fathers through Moses. The sons of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hivites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites. And they took their daughters for themselves as wives. They gave their own daughters to their sons and served other gods. Okay, the cycle. This is, again, something that we, I think, actually laid out in our first class because we're familiar with it. But let's go through it again. First of all, the cycle, and then is there something here in the last part of chapter 2, 19 to 23, that gives us a little bit more dimension to this cycle in the story of the book of Judges. So you tell me, the cycle of sin here in Judges, how does this work? What's the first thing that kicks it all off here? Yeah, it's their sin. And what does that sin look like? Rebellion, okay. Sin, rebellion. Worshipping the Baals. Not just the Baals. The Ashtaroth is like the female version, perhaps. But they did evil in the sight of the Lord. Remember that sight thing becomes important later on at the end, right? They did what was right in their own sight. But they did evil in the sight of the Lord, it says. They served the Baals. They forsook him. They rebelled against him. Okay? And so, what's the result of that? Yeah, they're overcome, taken under the rule of others, Albert says. How is that? That's described. It's described in several different ways throughout this passage. How is that described, the rule of other nations? First of all, may I ask you this. Who's doing it to them? Who is the subject of the verbs here? Yeah, the Lord, and not every case, because it does say that their enemies overtook them or whatever. But yeah, there's several places here that the Lord, verse 14, the anger of the Lord burned against them. He gave them. Verse 15, wherever they went, the hand of the Lord was against them for evil. The Judges is very clear. The book of Judges is very clear that it's God who is turning against them, and he's using these other nations. Now, how are they described? What are some of the nouns or verbs used to describe these nations that God uses? Maybe my translation's different than you. What does it say in verse 14 in y'all's translations if it doesn't say what mine says? Plundered, yeah. The plunderers who plundered. Don't you love that? We get that repetition like that. These nations were, in verse 14, plunderers who plundered. What is that? Are there other words that are used there in verse 14 that are different? Spoils, okay. what does that call to mind? And why say it that way? Why say that these nations were plunderers? It's like they're pirates or something. So let's run with that. So John says they come to take what is good of yours. So let's run with that in a couple different ways. Let's talk literally. What are the Israelites? What might they be plundered of by these surrounding nations? What good of theirs might other nations be taken? Okay, so they're required to pay tribute. That's going to come up in today's story. What do you use for tribute? Money, probably. So they're taking money. What else? Livestock. Yeah, land. They're taking the good land, the food. Okay. There's also another thing. These things are going to come or be significant in Judges. So, for instance, when Gideon's like hiding in the wine press, beating out some wheat, why is he down there beating out his little measly amount of wheat? Hiding away. Well, it's because the food has been plundered by the Midianites, and you got to kind of hold on to what's yours. There's something else, though, throughout the time of the Judges, maybe other times in Israelite history as well. Weapons. Okay, if I'm plundering, pirates, that plunder, they take swords and guns and weapons. They didn't have guns in Judges. Okay, so just making that clear here. But they take the weapons, and so so why is Shamgar running around with an ox goad? It's just like, well, it works as good as anything else. Maybe there's other reasons why we see some unique weapons of choice in the book of Judges. Okay, so God's hand is against them. I was going to say something else about it. We're taking too long here. So that's the literal plundering, but I think there's something more symbolic here going on, right? And take the mic to Harrison while you're getting there. I'll say this. Remember that the Israelites themselves were supposed to be the plunderers, okay? The language is used that the Israelites plundered the Egyptians because they left Egypt slaves that had conquered and taken all of Egypt's stuff with them. I mean, it's a total own in that way, okay? But they were also supposed to plunder the people of the land, to take their land, and so now the roles have been reversed, and they have totally missed what God intended for them, and they are now the ones being plundered by their oppressors. Yes, Harrison?
A plunderer is somebody that not only takes what they want and what they're going to take away, but they also destroy all that's left, so that even the good things that could have been left for the victims were destroyed.
Yep. I forget the phrases in Joel. What the flying locust left, the crawling locust ate. What the crawling locust ate, the buzzing locust ate. Lee.
You also, if you're being plundered, it's also indicating that you've been successful or that you have something worth plundering, that you've been blessed, that you have things that other people want to take from you. You don't plunder from people that don't have anything.
Yeah, and they had been tremendously blessed by God, entering in this land of milk and honey, and now they're squandering all that by being plundered. Maybe there's something to say for how sin ends up plundering our lives, taking from us valuable time and resources and effort and relationships that we have been blessed with. But because of our addiction to sin, Satan takes those things from us and leaves us devastated. Okay, the next thing in the cycle is what? After they're plundered, and this doesn't get a lot of airtime in this first passage here, but it is mentioned. What happens after they're oppressed? Yeah, they cry out to God. We do get that in verse 18, mention of it. That is their groaning that moves God to pity, right? So we'll see that they do cry out, and the result of that is, of course, that God hears, He's moved, and He raises up judges for them. We didn't talk about this. It's probably fairly intuitive. Judges, the word judge does not mean the way we use it today, okay? That a judge is more like a regional, chieftain or something that, has more of a military connotation. Most of the time. There are judges in the book of Judges, and then like Samuel, who serve more of a kind of judicial or at least kind of shepherding function. But these judges were military leaders that rose up by the hand of God to take care of the problem, to defeat the enemies. We could talk about this forever and ever, and I'm sure we'll continue to talk about it today and as we go forward. But just think about this. This happens over and over and over again. And every time, at least in Judges and beyond, God hears them and God answers. No matter how many times they've turned away, no matter how many years it took them to finally come around and say, okay, God, help us. He's faithful, beyond faithful to his people, to hear them and to answer. But it says that after that, they go back to sin. Now, this is the other question I asked you. Look at verse 19 to 23 in particular. What do those verses say about the nature of this cycle? What are you going to say, Albert? Yeah. It's not just a one-dimensional, they go back to where they started, and then they come back to where they started. It makes very clear that they are worse each generation than the generation before them. And I think it was Dan that mentioned this phrase, they didn't do as their fathers. Where was that? Verse 19, they turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers. Okay, more corruptly than their fathers, but in each generation, how good are the fathers? Well, the fathers are worse and worse, and then in each generation, they're still not even as good as the fathers before them. Okay, and have that in your mind. So you remember this from, kids' Bible class, the cycle, but let's make it more complex here. Oh, by the way, I should have set this up with more gusto here. I don't love the words, but they do all start with S. So if this helps you to remember, sin, servitude, supplication, and salvation, there you go. There's your alliteration. Brian's not even here. I did this just for Brian, and he's out of town. So Brian, if you're out there somewhere, this is for you. Okay. Judges really, though, is more so a downward spiral. Okay, so what we're going to see in terms of the outline, the flow of the book of Judges is that these first 3 chapters in many ways just set the stage for what's going to happen. If nothing else, maybe up to chapter 3, verse 6, where we read, is kind of the author setting up, here's kind of, here's the story, here's what happens. But even chapter 3 itself helps us to establish the pattern. We have Othniel, we have Ehud, we have Shamgar. There's fun stuff in those stories, but those are pretty straightforward. Enemies oppressed, God raises a judge, there's peace, and then happens again in the days of Ehud, and so forth. Okay, but then from there, we're not just moving in a circle, we're moving downward. Okay, so Deborah and Barak in chapter 4 and 5, pretty good all the way through, right? But I think we're going to see that it's not as good as it could be. Right, particularly with the character of Barak, maybe not quite the Othniel or the David, of course, but not quite the great hero of faith that we might think, although he does technically make it into Hebrews 11. But then from there, really, it just kind of gets worse. So we're going to see this. We think of Gideon as like a man of faith, and he is again also mentioned. But we want to see that from chapter 6, when Gideon's introduced to chapter 9, where Gideon's son is now a king and a tyrant, that there's a very clear drop-off in terms of the failures of Gideon in some very clear ways, not only in his life again, but in the next generation. But then after that, it just then spirals out of control. You'll remember but that story ends with him offering his daughter as a burnt offering, human sacrifice, to Jehovah. And then the story of Samson, there's almost nothing good you can say about Samson. And even the good things, you could argue whether those are really that good or not. Okay, but I think, again, go back to our original point, there's a reason why the stories are patched together the way they are in the book of Judges. Okay, and one of the purposes, I believe, is that the author is intentionally trying to show us how things are devolving, as chapter 2 says. That, yes, there is this cycle of God always raises up a deliverer, but the deliverers themselves have worse and worse character, less and less faith, more and more wickedness as the stories go on. By the time you get to, really any of them, but especially by the time you get to Jephthah or Samson, you're like, man, where's Othniel when you need him, right? Somebody that there's nothing bad to say about them. And then, to cap it all off, we have this epilogue, which actually, as you see, takes up quite a bit. It's 5 chapters at the end of extra stories, bonus material in the book of Judges, and those are the most horrifying stories of all. This time, not about the judges themselves. So, chapters 4 to 16 show us the judges themselves are worsening and worsening down to Samson. Chapter 17 to 21 is where we see the repeated phrase that the people did what was right in their own eyes. And we get a graphic, horrifying look at what's happening just on the ground level. People in Israel and how wickedly they are behaving towards each other and towards God, ending in civil war and the near elimination of one of the 12 tribes of Israel. So this is the image we want to keep in mind with Judges. Not just a cycle, but a spiral, downward spiral. Questions, comments on this? Obviously, we'll talk more in detail on these things as we go. Cool. Judges 3, 1 to 6, I asked you about this, the testing of Israel, and maybe we'll move on from this. We talked about this on Wednesday, but you see it again in chapter 3. God wanted his people to know what it is to fight, okay? And so he talks about with the people that are left behind, all these ites that are mentioned several times in these verses. God knew that his people had forgotten what it meant to fight for what was theirs. And so part of the purpose of leaving these people behind was to test them, to put them to the test, to fight and to learn what it means to obey or to not obey. But the other maybe purpose for leaving them behind was to give them over to their own failures. And so as we talked about on Wednesday, the initial failure of not driving out the people from the land led to those people sticking around, which led to living among those people, which led to marrying among those people. And that's how you get the generational decline in the book of Judges and beyond. So the peoples are left around. Why? Because God has just given them the natural consequences of their failure, and because God wants them to, continue to fight, and hopefully through that fighting to learn something about who they're supposed to be and what they're supposed to be about. Okay, anything on chapter 3? Sorry we had to kind of fly through that. All right, Robert, how much time do I have? 10 minutes for the whole lesson. Here we go. This is lesson 2, class number 2, the handout you have, which has on the top just a cycle for you to fill out on your own. Maybe you can do that later as a review. Othniel, chapter 3, verse 7 to 11. Think about Othniel and what might tell us that things are good here with the story of Othniel. Chapter 3, verse 7, the sons of Israel did what was right. Sorry, Sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, forgot the Lord their God, and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, so he sold them into the hands of Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. And the sons of Israel served Cushan-Rishathaim 8 years. When the sons of Israel cried to the Lord raised up a deliverer, the sons of Israel to deliver them. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel when he went out to war. The Lord gave Cushan-Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hand, so that he prevailed over Cushan-Rishathaim. And the land had rest 40 years. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. Okay, I would love to hear, honestly, I would love to hear what you have to say, but I think we'd have more fun talking about Ehud. So real quickly here on Othniel, their details are important. He's of the tribe of Judah. We learned from chapter 1. I think I had that on here. Being of the tribe of Judah, being the nephew of Caleb, I think we get a little bit of a picture of who this guy is. Remember in chapter 1, it was like, who's going to go conquer this area? You'll get my daughter. Othniel stands up and does. I mean, Othniel is kind of like a knight in shining armor, fighting for the lovely lady. Picture of nobility, Maybe he's a terrible guy. We're just not told. But I think the idea is here's a pretty straightforward story of someone who trusting in God. It says that several times, or at least once here, that they cried to the Lord. He raised up a deliverer. Spirit of the Lord came upon him. The Lord gave king of Mesopotamia into his hand. And so everything is as it should be, I think is the picture here with Othniel. Okay, trusting in God, and the Mesopotamians are defeated. But I will say, just as a note to keep in mind, don't think, based off the story of Othniel, that the Spirit of the Lord being with somebody is like a full endorsement of that person and their character. Because we're going to see later on, the Spirit of the Lord is going to empower some people that we would not want to imitate or do things in the way that they're doing. And so maybe we'll talk about that. It's a more complex conversation to have later in the book. But notice that Othniel's a good guy, but also don't think that just because the Spirit of the Lord is with him means that that's an automatic endorsement. But they have rest for 40 years, and that leads us to the next judge. Okay, let's read about Ehud, chapter 3, verse 12. As we read, think about who is Ehud, how would you describe him, and why is the story told in the way that it is, ironic, humorous, and gross as it is? What's behind all that? Chapter 3, verse 12. Now, the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. The Lord strengthened Eglon, king of Moab, against Israel because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. And he gathered to himself the sons of Ammon and Amalek, and he went and defeated Israel and possessed the city of palms. By the way, that is Jericho in verse 13. The city of palms is the city of Jericho. The sons of Israel, verse 14, served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. But when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. The sons of Israel sent tribute by him to Eglon, king of Moab. Ehud made himself a sword which had 2 edges, a cubit in length. He bound it on his right thigh under his cloak. He presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. And Eglon was a very fat man. Came about that when he had finished presenting the tribute, that he sent away the people who had carried the tribute. But he himself turned back from the idols which were at Gilgal and said, I have a secret message for you, O king. And he said, keep silence. And all who attended him left him. Ehud came to him while he was sitting alone in his cool roof chamber. And Ehud said, I have a message for you from God. He arose from his seat. Ehud stretched out his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, thrust it into his belly. The handle also went in after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the sword out of his belly, and the refuse came out. Then Ehud went out into the vestibule and shut the doors of the roof chamber behind him and locked them. When he had gone out, his servants came and looked, and behold, the doors of the roof chamber were locked. And they said, he is only relieving himself in the cool room. They waited until they became anxious. Behold, he did not open the doors of the roof chamber. Therefore they took the key and opened them, and behold, their master had fallen to the floor dead. Now Ehud escaped while they were delaying, and he passed by the idols and escaped to Sarah. It came about when he had arrived that they blew the trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the sons of Israel went down with him from the hill country. He was in front of them. He said to them, pursue them. The Lord has given your enemies, the Moabites, into your hand. So they went down after him and seized the fords of the Jordan opposite Moab, did not allow anyone to cross. They struck down at that time about 10,000 Moabites, all robust and valiant men, and no one escaped. So Moab was subdued that day under the hand of Israel, and the land was undisturbed for 80 years. Okay, I wish we had more time. What do you want to say about Ehud? How would you describe him? What do we know about him? What do we take from the plot in which he acts? And maybe what do we make about the whole story? Why does it happen the way that it does? Why are we told so many unwanted details, perhaps, about how he dies and how Ehud manages to escape? Anything you want to say about it? Albert?
Stories of where, in cinema or in stories, if you're trying to take down that one person, oh, he's impossible. You can't get to him. But yet you see God is able to use his left-handedness to allow him to get close to the king and all. So I take that away from the story, is that when you think things are impossible, God can make things happen with what's available before him.
When you think things are impossible, God makes a way, uses unexpected means. Albert says, the left-handedness is key. There's some talk about this. There's a possibility that he had a disability in his right arm, right hand. The text maybe indicates that. So, there would be no threat of somebody who had a weak right hand. Or it could just be that he's devious. In fact, and I think I have this here, in chapter 20, verse 16, apparently there's a bunch of people in Benjamin. The name Benjamin means son of my right hand. So naturally, Benjamin had a bunch of left-handed warriors. Maybe that's just a thing. They practiced that. And Ehud was able to use that skill. But I think the point's the same. Someone wasn't expected, and he's able to do the impossible thing because God is making it happen. And that's true with Ehud, and that's one of the themes of the whole book of Judges. Other things you want to say about this? Yes, Harrison.
I believe that when they talk about left-handedness, they stood on one side of the king, and if they were left-handed, they then had the ability to take that left hand and kill the king much more readily and quickly than they would have, because normally if an individual was right-handed, then they stood on the right side or the left side, so that the king was safe.
Yeah, so what seems to be a disadvantage is able to use as a clear advantage. I wish we could, this is just a lot of fun to talk about. The visual of Eglon, I think, is important here. Notice in verse 17, it says that he is a very fat man right after saying that Ehud brought him the tribute. This goes back to our point about plundering, right? That Eglon is a picture of a guy that's getting fat off of the plundering of Israel, okay? And so he is totally embarrassed. I mean, he's literally disemboweled, right? Stabbed through his belly, the refuse comes out, right? And then, just to end on this note before we all go to lunch, the fact that he died in that way and that all that was on the floor, then Ehud closes the door and leaves, and the servants come and they get a whiff of what's going on, and they're like, okay, we don't want to disturb him. He's in there doing his business. They stand around, and this whole time, while Eglon's, intestines are on the floor, Ehud's making his escape, and that allows them to then win the victory. And the stout men of verse 29, not the same word, but the robust men, that's a word about being big too. And so not just Eglon, but the Moabites were, hardy individuals. And yet, with God's help, Ehud is able to lead the men to block them off at the Jordan. This is what it looks like here. Surround them behind Jericho, block off the Jordan so they can't get back to Moab, and slaughter them there by the river. Okay, maybe we'll pick up here with Shamgar on Wednesday, but we'll try to spend most of our time actually getting through the material of Judges 4 and 5. Thank you, guys.